She was mid-sentence when he did it. She was talking about Daniel's school options in Seoul, about the conversation with Marcus, about logistics and timelines and what her mother thought, and whether the guest room needed repainting before Daniel arrived. All of it coming out in a rush. And then she looked up because Jae-won had gone quiet. He was already looking at her, focused, unhurried, like she was the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. Except this time his hand was on the table between them. And in his hand was a small box. Dark. Simple. Open. Victoria stopped talking. I heard everything you said. I want all of it. The school decisions and the logistics and the guest room and whatever your mother thinks. I want Daniel. I want the full life, Victoria. Not the version of it we've been building toward. The actual thing. She looked at the ring. Then at him. You just proposed to me while I was talking about paint colors. You weren't going to stop talking, he replied. She looked at him for a long moment. This man. This impossible, controlled, quietly devoted man who had peeled garlic in her kitchen and held a toy dinosaur with complete sincerity and sat in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. and come completely undone and come back anyway. Okay, she responded. He almost smiled. He took the ring from the box and reached across the table and put it on her finger. Just the two of them at a table in a quiet restaurant while Seoul moved indifferently outside the window. She looked down at her hand, then back up at him. She didn't cry, but something in her face opened, completely unguarded, completely certain, and he saw it and held it somewhere permanent. Welcome to Afro-Korean Love Stories. Today's episode is the one you have been waiting for. If you're just joining us for the first time, hit that like button, subscribe, turn on your notification bell so you don't miss out on new story drops, sit back, and allow me draw you into my world of tales. Also, let me know in the comments which city you are watching from. I want to see how far these amazing stories have traveled. Now, let's get back to it. It had started 3 weeks earlier with a video call. Victoria was in the kitchen finishing the last of the evening cleanup when her phone rang. She answered without looking. She knew the time. She knew who it was. Daniel appeared on the screen in his pajamas, hair wild, dinosaur in hand. The usual. They talked the way they always talked. Him reporting everything about his day with the breathless urgency of someone delivering breaking news, her listening with complete attention, the way she always did. His teacher had said something funny. He had eaten all his vegetables without being asked. He had taught his best friend one of his Korean words and mispronounced it so badly his friend had laughed for 10 minutes. Victoria was laughing too when Daniel went quiet. That meant he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. Mommy. Yeah, baby. I want to come live with you. In Korea. For always. The kitchen was very still. Not just visiting, Daniel said carefully, making sure she understood. I want to live there. With you and Halmoni and Han Jae-won. Victoria set down the cloth in her hand. Where is this coming from, baby? I've been thinking about it, he said with complete seriousness. The expression of a 6-year-old who had given something genuine consideration and arrived at a conclusion he was confident in. For how long? Since the last time I left. It didn't feel right. Leaving didn't feel right. Victoria looked at her son on that screen and said, Let me talk to some people. Okay, Daniel replied. Then, is Halmoni better? She's getting there. Tell her I said feel better faster. Victoria smiled. I'll tell her just that. She ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone again. She had 2 conversations ahead of her. One was going to be straightforward. The other she had been putting off for weeks. She made the harder call first. Marcus, her ex-husband, picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was the same as it had always been, warm, unhurried, the particular ease of a man who had never needed to perform anything for anyone. Just 2 people who had grown in different directions and had the maturity to wish each other well from a distance. Vic, he said unhurried. I need to talk to you about Daniel, she responded. She told him everything. Korea, the stability she had built, the family Daniel had found in that mansion, the school options, the life that was waiting for their son on the other side of a decision neither of them could make alone. Marcus was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Is he happy there? Is he safe? He asked. Victoria thought about the man who had sat on a staircase with her son and held a toy dinosaur with complete sincerity, who had covered him with a blanket without being asked, who had eaten every dessert Daniel set aside for him, without ever making it a moment. "He's safe," she said. "Completely." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Then it sounds like you already know what the right answer is." "I wanted to make sure you knew too," she said. "He's my son, Vic. I want what's best for him, even when what's best for him isn't about me." Victoria closed her eyes for just a second. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he replied. "Just take care of him." "Always," she said. She ended the call, sat on the edge of the kitchen counter. The mansion was quiet around her. She had one more conversation ahead of her, and Jae-won had just asked her to dinner. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't need to announce itself. No sign above the door worth reading from the street. Just a number and a handle, and the understanding that if you knew, you knew. Jae-won had chosen it, quietly, deliberately, with complete attention to what the moment required. Victoria had worn a deep wine red dress. Nothing elaborate. Just the kind of thing a woman wears when she wants to feel like herself and look like she made an effort without looking like she tried too hard. Her hair was up. Her grandmother's earrings. She had stood in front of the mirror in her room for exactly 3 minutes before deciding she was done looking and went downstairs. Jae-won was waiting in the entrance hall. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, that focused, unhurried attention that had never once felt like assessment. Just recognition, like he was confirming something he already knew. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. Just, she knew what her face did when he said things like that, and she preferred to get through the front door first. He almost smiled, held the door open. The drive through Seoul was quiet and easy. They had long since moved past the kind of silence that needed filling. The city moved outside the windows, and neither of them felt the need to perform conversation. That had always been one of the things between them, the ability to be in the same space without requiring anything of it. The restaurant received them without fuss. A table in the corner. Private without being conspicuous. Candlelight that managed not to feel deliberate. A menu that required no explanation. They ordered. They talked. The easy back and forth that had defined every evening in that kitchen, except this time there was no stove between them, no counter to lean on, no excuse to look away. Just a table and 2 people, and the particular intimacy of a first real date between people who already know each other completely. Then Victoria started talking about Daniel. The video call, what Daniel had said, the quiet certainty of him. Then Marcus, she told him about that call too, about how it had gone, about what Marcus had said at the end. She talked about her mother and what Grace thought, and what it would mean for Daniel's schooling and the guest room, and the timeline, and all of it coming out in one long, careful exhale. She was mid-sentence when Jae-won went quiet. She looked up. The ring was already on the table. Dark box. Simple. Open. Not large. Not showy. Just exactly right. Victoria stopped talking. The restaurant suddenly went quiet. "I heard everything you said," Jae-won said. "I want all of it. The school decisions. The logistics. The guest room. Whatever your mother thinks needs to happen. I want Daniel." A pause. "I want the full life, Victoria. Not the version we've been building toward. The actual thing." She looked at the ring, then at him. "You just proposed to me while I was talking about paint colors," she said. "You weren't going to stop talking," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had peeled garlic in her kitchen with complete seriousness. Who had sat on a staircase with her son and held a toy dinosaur like it mattered. Who had come undone in a hospital corridor and come back anyway. Who had stood at a kitchen window with his forehead against hers and kissed her like he had been waiting his whole life to do it correctly. "Okay," she said. He almost smiled. He took the ring from the box and reached across the table and put it on her finger. No ceremony. No audience. Just 2 people at a corner table in a quiet Seoul restaurant making the most permanent decision of their lives with the same unhurried certainty they had brought to everything else. She looked down at her hand, then back up at him. She didn't cry, but something in her face opened completely. All the composure she carried so carefully through every waking hour simply gone for one unguarded moment. He saw it. He held it somewhere he would not lose it. "There's something else," she said after a moment. He waited. "When Daniel comes, when this becomes real and permanent and daily, your world becomes his world. Not directly, but adjacently. And I need to know that you have thought about what that means. Not just for me, for him." Jae-won looked at her steadily. I thought about it before I came back to that kitchen the first time after you told me about him. I have people whose only job is to make sure the people I care about are never touched by what I do. Daniel will never feel it. Neither will you. That is not a promise I make lightly. I know you don't make promises lightly. She looked at him. He looked back. Okay, she responded finally. This time he did smile. Small and real and completely unguarded. The smile she had seen maybe 6 times in all the months she had known him. She had kept count without meaning to. They stayed at the restaurant for 3 hours, talking about everything and nothing the way they always had. Except now there was a ring on her finger and a future that had stopped being theoretical and become simply the next thing. They talked about Daniel's school, about what the wedding might look like, about Grace, who was going to have opinions about everything and be right about most of them, about Mrs. Han, who was going to be insufferably pleased with herself and completely entitled to it. They laughed about that one. Both of them. Real and easy. It was late when they left. Jae-won held the restaurant door, and she walked through it, and their hands found each. It felt natural. They drove home through Seoul in comfortable silence. Victoria looked out the window, at the city moving past. Her city now. The place she had come to start over that had become something she could never have planned. She looked down at the ring on her hand in the dark of the car. Then she looked at the man beside her. He was watching the road. Calm. Unhurried. Already forward-facing the way he always was. Not celebrating what had just happened, but simply moving into it with the quiet certainty of a man who had made his decision and was done second-guessing. She turned back to the window. Some things, she thought, you don't need to examine. The mansion was quiet when they got back. Mrs. Han's light was off. The kitchen was still. Everything was exactly where they had left it. Jae-won locked the front door. Victoria went to the kitchen out of habit, not to cook, just to stand in the space that had started all of it. The marble counters. The warm pendant lighting. The stool where he always sat. He appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. Leaned against the frame. Watched her standing in the kitchen. What are you doing? He said. Nothing, she replied. Just standing here. He looked at her standing in that kitchen. That woman. In his mother's kitchen that had become her kitchen, that had become the center of everything. Come to bed, he said quietly. She turned off the kitchen light. And for the first time in a very long time, Victoria Williams walked away from that kitchen without looking back. Daniel arrived on a Thursday. He came through the mansion's front door with his backpack on, a dinosaur in each hand. He stood in the entrance hall and looked around. It still smells the same, he announced. Grace appeared behind him pulling a suitcase. She looked at Victoria like a woman who had been on a plane with a child for 14 hours and had earned every gray lock on her head. Victoria took the suitcase. How was the flight? He talked the entire way, Grace said. To me. To the man beside us. To the flight attendant. To himself when everyone else fell asleep. Daniel was already moving through the entrance hall toward the kitchen. Is Halmoni here? Is Han Jae-won here? Can I have something to eat? Is my room the same room? Yes. Not yet. Yes. And yes. Victoria called after him. Daniel disappeared into the kitchen. They heard him open the refrigerator with the comfortable familiarity of someone who lived there. Grace set her bag down and looked at her daughter. Really looked. At the ring. At her face. At the particular way Victoria was standing settled. Rooted. Grace took her face in both hands. My baby, she said softly. Victoria covered her mother's hands with her own. Don't start, Mama. I'm not starting anything, Grace said. I'm finishing something. I've been watching you build this for a long time. Victoria pressed her lips together. Nodded once. Grace let go of her face and picked up her bag. Now. Where is this man so I can look at him properly? Mrs. Han was in the garden when Daniel found her. He came through the glass doors at speed and stopped just before reaching her, remembering at the last second that she was still recovering and that running at her was probably not the correct approach. He stood 3 feet away, vibrating with the effort of containing himself. Mrs. Han looked at him, opened her arms. He closed the distance immediately. She held him for a long time, her eyes closed, her face in his hair. Daniel's arms around her waist, holding on with a particular grip of a child who had missed someone and is making up for it all at once. I told you to get better faster, he said into her cardigan. I heard you, she said. I tried my best. You did good, he said generously. She laughed. That warm, unguarded laugh. and the garden felt like it exhaled. Jaewon arrived that evening to find the mansion completely transformed. Not physically, nothing had changed, but the energy of it. The noise level. Daniel's voice moving through the rooms. Grace in the kitchen having a spirited conversation with Victoria about whether the spice level of the pepper soup was appropriate. Mrs. Han at the island looking more herself than she had in months. Color in her face, sharpness in her eyes, the particular animation that Daniel's presence always produced in her. Jaewon stood in the entrance hall and listened to all of it for a moment. Then Daniel appeared at the top of the staircase, with a dinosaur in each hand. Han Jaewon, he said with great ceremony. I live here now. I heard, Jaewon said. Permanently, Daniel clarified. I understood the first time, Jaewon said. Daniel nodded, satisfied. Then held up the dinosaur in his left hand. I brought you something. Jaewon looked at it. A small plastic stegosaurus.
Green.
Missing one of its back plates. I have one already, Daniel said. So, you can have this one. So we match. Jaewon crossed the entrance hall and took the stairs two at a time and crouched down to Daniel's level. He took the stegosaurus, examined it with the complete sincerity he had given everything Daniel had ever handed him. Thank you. You're welcome, Daniel replied. Don't lose it. I won't. Daniel studied him for a moment with those sharp, perceptive eyes. Then, are you going to marry my mom? The staircase was very quiet. Yes, Jaewon responded. Daniel processed this, looked at the stegosaurus in Jaewon's hand, then back at him. Okay, that's good. Then he turned and went back to whatever he had been doing with the calm of a child who had just confirmed something he already knew and had no further questions about it. Jaewon stayed crouched on the staircase for a moment after Daniel left. Then he stood up, looked at the stegosaurus in his hand, went downstairs and put it on the kitchen windowsill where he could see it. Nobody commented on it, but everybody noticed. The dinner that evening was the loudest the mansion had ever been. Daniel talked continuously. Grace and Mrs. Han had found a new level of their friendship that involved finishing each other's sentences and ganging up on Victoria about the wedding catering. Victoria maintained firmly that she wanted to cook for her own wedding. Grace said absolutely not. Mrs. Han agreed with Grace. Victoria appealed to Jaewon, who looked at her with the expression of a man who had learned very quickly that there were certain battles not worth entering. You're supposed to be on my side, Victoria told him. I am on your side, he said, which is why I'm not getting involved. Daniel looked between all of them. I think Mommy should cook, he said loyally. Her food is the best food. Victoria pointed at her son. Thank you. But maybe not for the wedding, Daniel added thoughtfully, because then she'd be tired and she wouldn't be able to dance. Grace and Mrs. Han exchanged a look of complete triumph. Victoria looked at her 6-year-old. Whose side are you on? Daniel considered this seriously. Everyone's, he said. I'm on everyone's side. The table laughed. All of them. The kind of laughter that fills a house and stays in the walls. 3 nights later, after Daniel had been put to bed and Grace had retired and the mansion had settled into its evening quiet, Mrs. Han asked Victoria and Jaewon to sit with her in the living room. Not unusual. They sat with her most evenings. But something in the way she asked was different. Deliberate. The particular tone of a woman who had something to say and had chosen her moment. They sat. Mrs. Han had tea. She looked at both of them for a moment. Her son on one side, this woman on the other, with the warm, steady eyes of someone taking inventory of something precious. Then she began. She talked to Jaewon first. Not about the business. Not about the empire. About the man underneath it. About his father, and the particular inheritance of coldness that Jaewon had spent his whole life either replicating or fighting against. About what it meant to lead a family the way he led everything else. With intention, with presence, with the willingness to be known by the people who needed to know him. About Daniel specifically. About what a boy who had already lost one version of a family needed from the man who was choosing to become part of his next one. Jaewon listened the way he listened to everything that mattered. Completely. Then she turned to Victoria. She talked about what it meant to be married to a man like her son. The weight of his world. The way it would press against the edges of their life together in ways that would sometimes be invisible and sometimes not. She talked about the strength it required. Not the strength of enduring difficulty, but the strength of choosing every single day to stay present in a life that was never going to be simple. She talked about Daniel growing up inside that life and what it meant to raise a child with a full understanding of complexity without letting the complexity become the story. She talked for a long time, more than either of them had ever heard her speak at once. And when she was done, she reached out and took both their hands, one each, the way she always did, and held them without saying anything else. The living room was warm and still around them. Through the window, Seoul glowed at its usual indifferent brilliance. Victoria looked at this woman holding her hand. Something in the way Mrs. Han had spoken was sitting with her in a way she couldn't immediately name. The completeness of it. The way she had covered everything, past, present, future, with the thoroughness of someone making sure nothing was left unsaid. She looked at Jaewon. He was looking at his mother. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was feeling something he wasn't going to say. Mrs. Han squeezed both their hands once, then let go. Good, she said quietly. She picked up her tea. The conversation moved on to other things. The wedding venue, Grace's flight schedule, Daniel's school registration. Easy and warm and completely normal. But Victoria did not stop thinking about the way Mrs. Han had talked that evening. The completeness of it. The way it had felt less like advice, and more like something else entirely. Something she would only be able to name later. Much later. Now, before we proceed, Mrs. Han sat both of them down and said everything she needed to say. She talked about the past, the present, and the future. She left nothing out. Looking back, do you think something was off, or she was just giving her soon-to-be married son some motherly advice? Was it all just an act of love, or there was more to it than meets the eye? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story has you this deep already, hit that subscribe button, because this is where everything changes. And nothing will be the same after it. The wedding dress shopping happened on a Saturday. Grace had organized it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for this particular Saturday her entire motherhood. She had a list. She had opinions. She had a schedule that she presented to Victoria over breakfast like a business proposal, and that Victoria accepted without negotiating. Mrs. Han came too. She had insisted. She wore her best day dress. Soft cream with delicate detailing, her silver hair neatly set, and she arrived at the entrance hall at the agreed. The bridal boutique was in Cheongdam-dong. Quiet and elegant, and the kind of place that made you lower your voice when you walked in. The consultant greeted them with the practiced warmth of someone who understood that the women accompanying the bride were often as important as the bride herself, and adjusted accordingly. Victoria stood in front of the mirror in the first dress and said nothing. Grace said, "No." Mrs. Han said next. The second dress was worse. The third was better, but not right. The fourth made the consultant smile in a way that suggested she had been waiting to bring it out. Victoria stood in front of the mirror. The room went quiet. It was not elaborate. It was not covered in detail or architecture. It was the kind of dress that understood its job was to let the woman wearing it be the thing people looked at. Clean lines. The kind of white that sat beautifully against deep brown skin. A neckline that was elegant without trying to be. A silhouette that moved. Victoria looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Mrs. Han stood up from her chair, walked to the mirror, stood beside Victoria and looked at their reflections together. This tall, dark, beautiful woman in white, and this small, elegant Korean woman beside her, and her expression was the most complete Victoria had ever seen it. "This one," Mrs. Han said. Quietly. Finally. "This one," Grace agreed. From behind them, her voice slightly unsteady. Victoria looked at herself in the mirror for another moment. Then, at Mrs. Han beside her. "This one," Victoria said. They found the venue the following week. A private garden space in the hills above Seoul. Stone pathways. Old trees. A view of the city below that made everything look small and manageable and beautiful. Mrs. Han walked the grounds slowly with Victoria, while Grace took notes and asked the coordinator questions with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for this role her entire life. "Here," Mrs. Han said at one point, stopping at a particular spot where two old trees framed a view of the city below. "This is where you stand." Victoria looked at the spot, at the trees, at the city visible between them. "Yes," she said. Mrs. Han nodded. Moved on. The catering conversation happened on the drive home. Victoria had been thinking about it for days and had prepared her argument carefully. She wanted her team, but she also wanted to be involved. She would plan the menu. She would brief the team herself. She would. No. Grace said from the front seat. Mama, I haven't finished. You were going to say you wanted to be in the kitchen on your wedding day. The answer is no. I was going to say, Victoria Elaine. Silence. Mrs. Han patted Victoria's hand from the back seat. Your team will do it beautifully. You brief them. You plan the menu. And on the day you stand under those trees and you let other people take care of the food for once in your life. Victoria looked at Mrs. Han, then at Grace in the front seat. Both of you, she said, are very difficult. Yes, Grace said pleasantly. We know. Mrs. Han smiled into her window. Victoria looked out at Seoul passing by. Fine, she said, but I'm approving every single dish. Obviously, Grace and Mrs. Han said at the same time. The days that followed had the quality of a life in full motion. Daniel started at his new school and came home every afternoon with the breathless report of a child experiencing everything for the first time and finding all of it excellent. He had made a friend on the second day, a boy named Juno who spoke no English and with whom Daniel communicated entirely through gesture, shared snacks, and the universal language of two 7-year-olds who had decided to be friends and saw no reason to let a language barrier complicate that. He taught Juno the Korean word for dinosaur. Juno taught him something back that Daniel repeated proudly at dinner and that made Mrs. Han cover her mouth and Jaewon set down his chopsticks very carefully and Grace look at Victoria with the expression of a grandmother needing an explanation. What does it mean? Victoria asked. Jaewon looked at the ceiling. It means something Daniel should not be saying at the dinner table, Mrs. Han said with great composure. Daniel looked between all of them. Juno said it was hello. Juno lied, Jaewon said. Daniel processed this betrayal for a moment. Then, can I still be his friend? Yes, Victoria said. But we're going to have a conversation about checking words before you use them. Daniel nodded seriously, filed this away, went back to his food. The wedding was 6 days away when it happened. It was early morning, that gray in-between hour when the mansion was completely still and Seoul outside the windows was at its quietest. Victoria was already awake. She had been sleeping lighter than usual. The particular restlessness of a woman with too many good things happening simultaneously and a mind that refused to fully switch off. She heard the sound from Mrs. Han's room. Just wrong. A sound that doesn't belong in an early morning house. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. She opened Mrs. Han's door. The older woman was sitting on the edge of her bed. Both hands pressed to her chest. Her face the color of the gray sky outside. She looked up when Victoria appeared and attempted the composure. The automatic reaching for dignity. I'm fine, she said. Her voice was not right. Victoria crossed the room and was beside her in 3 steps. She took one look at Mrs. Han's face, at the gray of it, at the effort behind the composure, at the eyes that were more frightened than they were letting on, and picked up her phone. Then she called down the corridor. Jaewon. Once. The same way she had called him the night of the first collapse. That specific tone. He appeared in the doorway within seconds. Took one look at his mother. Was across the room. The ambulance came quickly. Victoria stood in the entrance hall watching them take Mrs. Han out for the second time. The same stretcher. The same blue lights moving across the walls. Except this time something felt different. Something in the air of the house felt different. Victoria could not name it. She tried to and couldn't. She locked the mansion. Jaewon rode in the ambulance. Daniel appeared at the top of the staircase in his pajamas. Victoria looked up at him. His face was sleep-soft and confused, the dinosaur loose in his hand, trying to understand what the blue lights meant. She went up the stairs, crouched down to his level. Is Halmoni sick again? He asked. The doctors are going to look after her, Victoria said. Daniel looked at the front door, then at his mother. Is it bad? Victoria looked at her son. This perceptive, fearless, completely honest child. I don't know yet, baby, she said. But I'm sure she'd be okay. She's in good hands. Daniel nodded slowly, held out his dinosaur. Take this, he said. For luck. Victoria took it, held it in her hand. Go back to bed. I'll call you as soon as I know anything. Daniel went back to his room without argument. Victoria stood at the bottom of the staircase for a moment. Then she got her keys and followed her future husband to the hospital once more, hoping for the worst not to go. The ER waiting area was different from the private hospital room they had become familiar with over the past months. Harder, brighter. the kind of lighting that made everything look more serious than you wanted it to be. Victoria sat in a plastic chair with Daniel's dinosaur in her hand and waited. Jae-won was inside. He had gone through the doors with his mother and hadn't come back out. Victoria didn't go after him. She understood instinctively that there were moments when presence meant waiting on the other side of a door rather than pushing through it. So she sat, and she held the small plastic dinosaur. The only thing she could do was hope and pray. Grace appeared 40 minutes after Victoria called her. She came through the ER entrance in her coat over her nightclothes, her gray locks unpinned. She sat beside Victoria without a word and took her hand. They sat like that for a long time. The ER moved around them. Nurses. Voices. Victoria watched all of it without seeing any of it. Her eyes kept going to the doors Jae-won had gone through. She was talking to us 3 nights ago, Victoria said quietly. She was completely herself. I know, Grace said. She had opinions about the venue. She told me which spot to stand in. She was completely herself. Grace squeezed her hand, said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the squeezing didn't already say better. An hour passed, then another. Jae-won came out once, briefly, just long enough to tell Victoria the doctor's in an active operation, and he was told to step out, that it was serious, that he was going back in. He looked at her for just a moment, long enough for something to pass between them that didn't need words, and then he went back through the doors. Victoria watched him go. She knew that face. She had seen it in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning. She knew what the controlled arrangement was covering. And she knew that right now the only thing she could do was be exactly where she was when he came back out. So she stayed. Daniel called at 7 in the morning. Victoria answered immediately. His voice was small. Is Halmoni okay? He asked. The doctors are with her, Victoria said. They're taking very good care of her. Okay, Daniel said. I'm going to draw her a picture. For when she comes home. Victoria closed her eyes for just a second. She would love that baby. A dinosaur, Daniel said. Because they're strong. Perfect, Victoria said. She ended the call. Grace was looking at her. He's drawing her a dinosaur, Victoria said. Grace looked at the ceiling, pressed her lips together. The doctor came out at 8:47 in the morning. Victoria knew before he reached them. She had learned over months of hospital waiting rooms how to read the approach of a doctor who was carrying news that needed sitting down for. The particular pace. The particular set of the face. The way the eyes landed on you a second before the words did. She stood up anyway. The doctor spoke quietly and carefully in the way that doctors who have done this many times speak, with precision and with a particular gentleness of someone who understands that the words they are about to use will divide a life into before and after. I'm so sorry. She didn't make it. The words landed in the waiting room, and the waiting room went completely still around them. Victoria felt Grace's hand tighten on hers. She stood with the information for a moment, holding it, feeling its full weight settle into her chest, and then she looked at the doors. Jae-won came through them 30 seconds later. He had heard it already. She could see it in his face. Just him. Stripped of all of it. The face of a man who has just lost the person who is always his north, the one constant in a life that had been built entirely around constants he could control. He walked through the ER past the chairs, past the nurse's station, through the entrance doors and out into the morning. It was raining, not heavily. He walked out into it and stopped on the pavement and stood there for a moment, the rain on his face, the city moving around him, everything completely indifferent to what had just happened inside. Then he turned and put his fist into the wall beside the entrance. Once. Hard. The sound of it cutting through the rain and the morning noise. He stood with his fist against the wall. His head dropped. His shoulders, those shoulders that had carried everything for so long, that had never once visibly buckled under the weight of an empire, dropped completely. Victoria was at the entrance doors. She had watched him walk out. She had followed to the threshold and stopped because she understood instinctively that this was a moment that needed its own space before it needed anything else. She waited. He stood in the rain for a long time. Then he straightened up, turned around, looked at her standing in the doorway. She held his gaze. He walked back toward her, stopped in front of her. The rain had soaked through his shirt. His face was completely open in a way she had only seen once before, in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning when she had put her hand on his back and held him steady. She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward and put her arms around him. He stood rigid for exactly 1 second. Then something gave way completely, and his arms came around her, and he held on with the grip of a man who needed something solid, and had found it, and was not letting go. They stood in the rain outside the E.R. entrance. The city moved around them. Victoria held him. She felt everything he wasn't saying move through him, the grief and the loss and the particular devastation of losing the one person who had always been irreplaceable. She held all of it with him, steady, present, without doing anything except being exactly where she was. After a long time he pulled back, looked at her. His eyes were dry. He had not cried. She didn't expect him to, not here, not yet. The grief of a man like Jaewon didn't move through him the way it moved through other people. It went somewhere deeper first, somewhere private, and it would come out in its own time in its own way. He started. Stopped. I know, she said. He nodded, looked at the city, back at her. Go, she said quietly. Take whatever time you need. We'll be there when you come back. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and walked into the rain, and the city swallowed him. Victoria stood at the entrance until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went back inside, back to Grace. She called Jaewon's lieutenant, a quiet, efficient man named Mr. Beck, who answered on the first ring and asked no unnecessary questions. She gave him what he needed. He said he would handle it. She thanked him and ended the call. Grace was looking at her. Daniel, Victoria said. I'll call him, Grace said immediately. Tell him. Victoria stopped. Thought about a 6-year-old boy at home drawing a dinosaur for a woman who is never going to see it. Tell him I'm coming home. Tell him we'll talk when I get there. Grace nodded, stood up, pulled Victoria into her for a moment, the particular embrace of a mother who knows her child is holding something enormous and wants her to know she is not holding it alone. Then she made the call. Victoria sat back down in the plastic chair. The editor moved around her. The rain moved against the windows. The small plastic stegosaurus was still in her hand, Daniel's, missing its back plate, the one he had pressed into her palm for luck on the staircase in the early morning dark. She looked at it for a long time. Jaewon did not come home that day. Victoria had expected this. She had told him to take the time he needed, and she had meant it. She kept the mansion running, quietly, steadily. She cooked because cooking was the thing her hands knew how to do when everything else was uncertain. She fed Daniel and her mother and answered Daniel's questions with the honest simplicity he always deserved. Daniel didn't take the news so well. He cried, sitting at the kitchen island with his head on Victoria's shoulder while she held him and said nothing because nothing was needed. After a while he sat up and wiped his face with the back of his hand. She knew everything, he said. She did, Victoria said. She knew about dinosaurs too. I taught her, he said with a teary voice. I know you did, Victoria said. She loved that. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Is Han Jaewon okay? He will be, Victoria said. He just needs a little time. Daniel nodded slowly, looked at the kitchen windowsill, where the stegosaurus stood. Then he climbed off his stool and went to the windowsill and picked it up and brought it back and set it on the island in front of him. When he comes back, Daniel said, give him this. Tell him it's for luck. Victoria looked at her son. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. Okay, she said finally. Daniel nodded, got back on his stool, picked up his fork. Can I have more rice? He said. Jaewon came back the following evening. He came through the front door quietly, no announcement, no explanation of where he had been. He looked like a man who had been alone with something enormous for 24 hours and had come out the other side not lighter, but different. Changed in the way that grief changes people, not breaking them but rearranging them into a shape that has more room for what matters. Victoria was in the kitchen when she heard the front door. She didn't go to him immediately. She gave him 60 seconds to stand in the entrance hall of his mother's house and feel whatever he needed to feel in that first moment of being back. Then she walked out of the kitchen. He was standing in the entrance hall, still in yesterday's clothes. He looked at her when she appeared. She crossed the hall and stopped in front of him, held out the stegosaurus. He looked at it. Daniel said to give it to you. He said it's for luck. Jaewon looked at the small plastic dinosaur in her outstretched hand for a long moment. Then he took it, closed his hand around it, and for the first time since the ER, in his mother's entrance hall, with his family sounds coming from the kitchen, and the rain finally stopped outside, and Seoul doing what it always did beyond the windows. Han Jae-won's composure came completely undone. It happened quietly. The way things happen with him. Nothing loud, nothing performed. Just his face, finally, after 24 hours of carrying it alone, letting everything through. Victoria stepped forward and put her arms around him. He held on. Daniel appeared at the top of the staircase, saw them, and sat down on the top step without a word. He held his dinosaur in his lap and sat there quietly, present, watchful, the most perceptive 6-year-old in Seoul, keeping them company from a respectful distance. Grace appeared in the kitchen doorway, saw Jae-won, saw Victoria holding him, saw Daniel on the stairs. She went back into the kitchen. Turn the stove on low, because some things you hold, and some things you feed. And Grace Williams had always known which was which. The funeral planning began the following morning. It was not what any of them had expected to be doing that week. The venue booking that Grace had been coordinating became a different kind of phone call. The flowers that had been chosen for a wedding became flowers for something else. The week that had been supposed to move toward a celebration moved instead through the particular weight of arranging a goodbye for someone who had not given anyone enough warning to prepare for it. Jae-won handled the arrangements the way he handled everything, with precision and complete attention. He made the calls. He confirmed the details. He sat with the people who needed to be sat with and said the things that needed saying and held the weight of it without letting it show in any room that required him to be functional. But he came home every evening. That was new. That was different from before. He came home every evening and sat at the kitchen island, his stool, the one that had always been his, and let Victoria feed him, and let Daniel talk at him about school and Juno and dinosaurs and whatever else was filling his 6-year-old mind. And somewhere in the middle of all of that ordinary noise, the day's weight would shift slightly. Not lift. Just shift. Into something more bearable. Victoria watched this happen every evening and said nothing about it, because it didn't need saying. Mrs. Han's funeral was on a Thursday. The ceremony was private. Intimate. The people who had genuinely known Mrs. Han rather than the people who knew Han Jae-won. There were more of the first kind than most people would have expected for the mother of a man like him. Mrs. Han had moved through the world quietly and left a mark on it that her son's power had nothing to do with. Victoria sat beside Jae-won through all of it, her hand in his. Daniel on his other side, still, serious, wearing the small dark suit Grace had bought him 2 days before with the decisive efficiency of a grandmother. At one point during the service, Daniel leaned across and whispered something in Jae-won's ear. Jae-won looked at him. Daniel whispered it again. Jae-won nodded once. Victoria looked at her son. What did you say? Daniel looked straight ahead at the front of the room. I told him Halmoni knew everything, and that people who know everything don't really go anywhere. The room blurred slightly at the edges for Victoria. She looked forward, pressed Jae-won's hand. He pressed back. They laid Mrs. Han to rest on a gray Thursday morning with her roses on the casket, and the people who had genuinely loved her standing in the rain that had returned quietly and without announcement the way Seoul rain always did. And then they went home. 3 weeks later the wedding happened. Not as originally planned. Simpler. Quieter. The garden in the hills above Seoul with the 2 old trees, and the view of the city below that Mrs. Han had pointed to and said, this is where you stand. Victoria stood exactly there. At the front of the space, Mrs. Han's photograph sat in a frame surrounded by her favorite flowers, the roses from her garden, white and cream and perfect. Daniel sat in the chair beside the photograph in his dark suit. At some point during the ceremony, he reached over and straightened the frame carefully, then sat back with his hands in his lap and his dinosaur tucked inside his jacket pocket. Grace cried from the moment Victoria appeared at the entrance of the garden. She made no attempt to manage it. She simply cried with the open, unguarded emotion of a woman who had watched her daughter carry a very long and difficult road and had arrived at this moment with the full weight of all of it. Victoria's team had handled all the food. Every dish from the menu Victoria had planned herself. The combinations that told the story of 2 people who had found each other across 2 cultures in a kitchen that smelled of gochujang and jollof and brown butter and something that had no name except home. Jae-won stood at the front of the garden between the 2 old trees and watched Victoria walk toward him. He did not look away once. She reached him. He took her hands, looked at her face, that face, the one he had been watching since a galley kitchen on a yacht in Busan Harbor, The one that had never once performed anything for him. The one that had looked at him like he was simply a man from the very first moment and had never stopped. The officiant spoke. They answered when required. The ceremony was short because everything that needed to be said between them had already been said. In kitchens and hospital corridors and plastic chairs and rainy pavements and quiet entrance halls. When it was done, Jae-won reached into his pocket. He brought out the Stegosaurus. Victoria looked at it. Then at him. Daniel said it was for luck, he said quietly.
He told me the same thing, she said.
Jae-won closed his hand around it, took her face in his other hand, and kissed his wife for the first time in the garden where his mother had pointed, and said, "This is where you stand." Daniel, from his chair, pumped his fist once. Grace laughed through her tears. Seoul glowed below them, distant, brilliant, completely indifferent. The same city that had received Victoria Williams with her knives and her grief, and her son in Atlanta and her fresh start, and had given her all of this in return. All of it. This is what it looks like when love does not arrive the way you planned it. When it arrives through a grandmother's recipe and a yacht in Busan Harbor and a kitchen that smelled of 2 continents and a 6-year-old boy who decided within 48 hours that he was already home. This is what it looks like when the woman who started everything, who passed a phone number to an executive simply because she wanted her son eating well, turns out to have started something so much larger than any of them could have seen from where they were standing. Mrs. Han knew everything. And people who know everything don't really go anywhere. So let me ask you this. Mrs. Han's life talk, 3 nights before she collapsed, covered everything. Past, present, and future. She left nothing out. Do you think she knew she was saying goodbye? And if she did, was keeping it from them the most loving thing she could have done? Or did they deserve to know? Drop your answers below. Share this episode with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who love us best are sometimes the ones who leave us the most completely prepared. Subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on your notifications. And until the next story, take care of yourself. Real love stays, even when it has to go somewhere else first.